press the bell icon on the YouTube app and never miss another update.
Hello dear students, I'm Dr. Denzy Lawrence and today we'll be continuing the chapter on the rise of nationalism in the Indian context. Now so far we have understood the idea of Satyagraha, the development of the non-cooperation movement and how the various events actually led towards development of the civil disobedience. Now in the previous two sessions we saw in detail about the various things which happened and the contribution of various national leaders and their continued contribution towards the development of a nationalistic spirit and fervor. Now moving on in today's session, we shall be talking about the Salt March and the civil disobedience movement. Now Mahatma Gandhi found in salt a powerful symbol that could unite the entire country. On 31st January 1930, he sent a letter to Viceroy Irwin stating 11 demands. Now some of these were of general interest and others were specific demands of different classes of people from industrialists to the peasants. The idea was to make the demands wide-ranging so that all the classes within the Indian society could identify with them and everyone could be brought together in a united campaign. The most stirring of all was the demand to abolish the salt tax. Salt was something which was consumed by the rich and the poor alike, and it was one of the most essential items of food. The tax on salt and the government monopoly over its production, Mahatma Gandhi declared, revealed the most oppressive face of British rule. So until now, people were protesting and falling out of agitation and were probably doing disobedience at a civil movement and non-cooperating with the government officials. The actual oppression of the British rule was exposed when people fought against the imposition of the salt tax. And that is how the Salt March eventually happened and culminated into the civil disobedience movement. Now Mahatma Gandhi's letter was in a way an ultimatum because if the demands were not fulfilled by 11th of March, the letter stated that the Congress would launch a civil disobedience campaign. Now Irwin was unwilling to negotiate. So Mahatma Gandhi started his famous Salt March or the Dandi March accompanied by 78 of his trusted volunteers. Now, the march was over 240 miles from Gandhiji's ashram in Sabarmati to the Gujarati coastal town of Dandi. The volunteers walked for 24 days, about 10 miles a day. Thousands came to hear Mahatma Gandhi wherever he stopped. And he told them that he meant by Swaraj and urged them to peacefully defy and go against the British. On 6th of April, he reached the Dandi and ceremonially violated the law manufacturing salt by boiling the sea water. Now this marked the beginning of the civil disobedience movement. Now how this movement was different from the non-cooperation movement are what we have to ponder upon. Now people were now not only asked to refuse the cooperation of the British, but also that they had done in 1921, but to break the colonial laws. So thousands in different parts of the country broke the salt law and manufactured salt and demonstrated in front of government salt factories. Now in this famous picture we can see the Dandi March is during which the Salt March where Mahatma Gandhi was accompanied by his 78 volunteers and on the way they were being followed and accompanied by many people in thousands. Now as this movement spread, foreign cloth was boycotted and liquor shops were picketed. Peasants refused to pay revenue and chowkidari taxes. Village officials resigned and in many places the forest people violated the forest laws, going into the reserve forest to collect the wood and to graze the cattle. Now worried by the developments, the colonial government began arresting the Congress leaders one by one. So this led to violent clashes in many parts of the country. When Abdul Ghaffar Khan, a devout disciple of Mahatma Gandhi, was arrested in April 1930, angry crowds demonstrated in the streets of Peshawar, facing armoured cars and police firing. Many were killed, and a month later when Mahatma Gandhi himself was arrested, the industrial workers in Solapur attacked the police posts, the municipal buildings, the law courts and railway stations, all the structures which symbolized your British rule. A frightened government responded with a policy of brutal repression. So peaceful satyagrahis were attacked, women and children were beaten up, and about 100,000 people were arrested. Here in this picture we can see how the people are being locked down and the satyagrahis are being oppressed and being put into jail and shown the forces of violence by the British rule. So, in such a situation, Mahatma Gandhi once again decided to call off his movement and enter into a pact with Irwin on 5th March 1931. By this, the Gandhi-Irwin Pact, Gandhiji consented to participate in a round table conference which the Congress had earlier boycotted the first round table conference in London, and the government agreed to release the political prisoners. Now, in the year 1931, Gandhiji went to London for the conference, but the negotiations broke down and he returned disappointed. Back in India, he discovered that the government had unleashed a new cycle of repression. Ghaffar Khan and Jawaharlal Nehru were both put into jail, and the Congress had been declared illegal, and a series of measures had been imposed to prevent the meetings, demonstrations, and the boycotts. With great apprehension, Mahatma Gandhi relaunched the civil disobedience movement. For over a year, the movement continued, but by 1934, it had lost its momentum. Now, here there is an ode which talks about the altar of revolution, which the youth has bought as incense. Many nationalists thought that the struggle against the British could not be won through non-violence. So in the year 1928, the Hindustan Socialist Republican Army was founded at a meeting in Feroz Kotla ground in Delhi. Amongst its leaders were the famous Bhagat Singh, Jatin Das and Ajay Ghosh. In a series of dramatic actions in different parts of the country, the HSRA actually targeted some of the symbols of British power. In the year 1929, Bhagat Singh and Batukeshwar Dutt threw a bomb in the Legislative Assembly. In the same year, there was an attempt to blow up the train which Lord Irwin was travelling in. Now, Bhagat Singh was 23 when he was tried and executed by the colonial government. And during this trial, Bhagat Singh stated that he did not wish to glorify the cult of the bomb and the pistol, but wanted a revolution in the society. So the famous slogan all of you would have heard is Inqilab Zindabad. So at this point of time, Bhagat Singh and his fellow comrades actually made this idea of revolutionary protest and agitation in a very, very dramatic form. So here it is said that revolution is the inalienable right of mankind. Freedom is the imprescriptible birthright of all, and the laborer is the real sustainer of society. To the altar of this revolution, we have brought our youth as incense. For no sacrifice is too great for so magnificent a cause. We are content and we await the advent of revolution. Inqilab Zindabad. So here we see that various parts of these movements had actually turmoil and brought a very sense of collective disobedience, actually turning into an armed struggle. So here the various participants, how they viewed this. Okay, what did people think about the civil disobedience movement, and how many of them joined if they did? What were their ideals, and what did Swaraj actually mean to them? Now, the civil disobedience movement in the countryside, where rich peasant communities like the Patidars of Gujarat and the Jats of UP were active in the movement. Because being producers of commercial crops, they were very hard hit by the trade repression and the falling prices. So as the cash income disappeared, they found it impossible to pay the government's revenue demand, and the refusal of the government to reduce the revenue led to a widespread resentment among the people. These rich peasants became enthusiastic supporters of the civil disobedience movement, organizing the communities and at times forcing the reluctant members to participate in these boycott programs. For them, the fight for Swaraj was a struggle against high revenues, but they were deeply disappointed when the movement was called off in the year 1931 without the revenue rates being revised. So when the movement was restarted, many of them refused to participate. On the other hand, the poorer peasantry were not just interested in the lowering of the revenue demand. Many of them were small tenants who were cultivating land which they had rented from their landlords. Now, as the Great Economic Depression continued and the cash incomes keep coming down, the smaller tenants found it difficult to pay their rent. They wanted the unpaid rent to the landlord to be remitted. They joined a variety of radical movements, often led by socialists and communists. Apprehensive of raising issues that might upset the rich peasants and landlords, the Congress was unwilling to support no-rent campaigns in most places. So the relationship between the Congress and the poor peasants remained uncertain. Now, what did the business classes do? How did they relate to the civil disobedience movement? During the First World War, the Indian merchants and the industrialists had made huge profits and had become powerful. Now they were keen on expanding their businesses, so they now reacted against the colonial policies that restricted their business activities. For example, they wanted protection against the import of foreign goods and a rupee sterling foreign exchange ratio that would discourage imports. Now, to organize the business interests, they formed the Indian Industrial and the Commercial Congress in the year 1920 and the Federation of the Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industries, FICCI, in the year 1927. Led by prominent industrialists like Purushottama Das Thakur Das and G.D. Birla, the industrialists attacked colonial control over the Indian economy and supported the civil disobedience movement. They gave financial assistance and refused to buy or sell imported goods, and most of these businessmen came to see Swaraj as a time where colonial restrictions on business would no longer exist and the trade and the industry will develop and flourish without having any problems. But after the failure of the Round Table Conference, the business groups also were no longer uniformly enthusiastic. They were apprehensive of the spread of militant activities and worried about prolonged disruption of business as well as the growing influence of the socialism among the younger members of the Congress. Now, the industrial working class did not participate in the civil disobedience movement except in the place of Nagpur region. So as these industrialists came closer and closer to the Congress, the workers stayed aloof and separate. In spite of that, some workers did participate in the civil disobedience movement, selectively adopting some of the ideas of the Gandhian program, like boycotting the foreign goods, as a part of their own movements against low wages and poor working conditions. There were also strikes by the railway workers in the year 1930 and the dock workers in the year 1932. In the year 1930, thousands of workers in Chota Nagpur tin mines wore Gandhi caps and participated in protest rallies and boycott campaigns. As the Congress was reluctant to include these workers' demand as a part of its program because it felt that this would alienate the industrialists and divide the anti-imperial forces. Another very important part or feature of the civil disobedience movement was the large-scale participation of women. During Gandhiji's Salt March, thousands of women actually came out of their homes to listen to him. They participated in protest marches, they manufactured salt, and similarly, as we can see, that they picketed the foreign cloth in the liquor shops. So in this image here we see that during the national movement, many women for the first time came out of their homes to a public arena, and among the marchers we can see there are many old women along with their children and the mothers being carrying them around. So we see that many of these people went to jail, and in urban areas where usually these women were from high caste families, in rural areas they came from the rich peasant farmers. So moved by Gandhiji's call, they began to see service to the nation as a sacred duty for women. Yet, this increased public role did not necessarily mean any radical change in the way the position woman was visualized. Now, Gandhiji was convinced that it was the duty of women to look after home and hearth, be good mothers and good wives, and for a very long time the Congress was reluctant to allow women to hold any position of authority within the organization. It was keen on only their symbolic presence. So we notice these are all how the various participants viewed the movement. Like I mentioned previously, the various farmer peasant communities of Patidars of Gujarat and Jats of UPs, they are actually fighting against that this civil disobedience was going to take care of the trade depression and the falling prices. Whereas the poorer farmers, as we noticed that because of depression, they were not able to pay rent and they were looking for remittance of rent. On the other hand, what about the business classes? Is because they were actually wanting protection against imports of foreign goods, and they formed various organizations like the Commercial Congress, Indian Industrial, and then the FICCI in 1927. And many people, would come together and see Swaraj as a time where the colonial restrictions on business were lifted. The industrial class, like I mentioned, was something which became closer to the Congress, the workers which stayed apart. So there were strikes, however, by the railway workers, by the dock workers in various parts of the country, but eventually the Congress was reluctant to include these workers because they felt that it would alienate the industrialists and divide the anti-imperial forces. Another keynote, feature of this civil disobedience movement was that women thronging the streets of the entire country. So the national movement, you see, women for the very first time came out of the confines of the public spaces into the public spaces and participated in the struggle. But at that point of time, let's also remember that it is only a symbolic presence and nothing more than giving the positions. So we see that civil disobedience movement is an important, significant part of history, where various parts and various sections and racial groups of the or social groups of the society participated under the leadership of many prominent leaders, the most being Gandhiji, in order to bring about this particular revolution. And also, like I said, talking about revolution, you also had the uprising by the development of the Hindustan Socialist Republican Army, which is again by a nation of people, of youngsters like Bhagat Singh and Chandrasekhar Azad and all of them coming together and actually concocted and going for an armed resistance. So this is how we notice that how the once area of where the salt march started in the Dandi March, which was to oppose the tax imposed and publicly actually manufacturing salt, the civil disobedience movement was a period in time where there were many agitations by many racial and social groups who are actually trying for the working of a united country. Now, after having discussed the civil disobedience movement and what it has achieved, let us also add a note on what were the limitations of the civil disobedience movement. Now, please remember here that not all social groups were moved by the abstract concept of Swaraj. Like we say that each one has got their own stakes in it. One such group was the nation's untouchables. Now, the nation's untouchables, who from around the 1930s had begun to call themselves Dalit or oppressed. For a very long time, the Congress had ignored the Dalits for fear of offending the Sanatanis, that is the conservative high caste Hindus. But Mahatma Gandhi declared that Swaraj would not come for about 100 years if untouchability was not eliminated. So he called the untouchables as Harijans, or the children of God. He organized satyagraha to secure them entry into temples, to make them get access to public wells, tanks, roads and schools, and he himself cleaned toilets to dignify the work of the bhangi, that is the sweeper. And he persuaded the upper caste to change their heart and give up the sin of untouchability. But many Dalit leaders were keen on a different political solution for the problem of the community. Now let's understand here that representation in the society is significantly moving towards a political nature. So they began organizing themselves, demanding reserved seats in educational institutions, and a separate electorate would mean that they choose Dalit members for the legislative council. So political empowerment, they believed, would resolve the problem of the social disability, and the Dalit participation in the civil disobedience was very limited, particularly in the Maharashtra and the Nagpur region, where the organization was very strong. So here enters Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who organized the Dalits into the Depressed Classes Association in the year 1930, clashed with Mahatma Gandhi at the second roundtable conference by demanding separate electorates for Dalits. When the British government conceded Ambedkar's demand, Gandhiji began a fast unto death. He believed that separate electorates for Dalits would slow down the progress of their integration into the society. That is, they would take a predominantly longer time to become a part of the united society. Now, Ambedkar ultimately accepted Gandhiji's position, and the result was the Pune Pact of September 1932. Now, what was this Pune Pact all about? It gave the depressed classes, later to be known as the scheduled classes, reserved seats in provincial and the central legislative councils, but were to be voted in by the general electorate. Now, the Dalit movement, however, continued to be apprehensive of the Congress-led national movement because some of the Muslim political organizations were also lukewarm in response to the civil disobedience movement. After the decline of the non-cooperation movement, the non-cooperation Khilafat movement, a large section of Muslims felt alienated from the Congress. Now, from the mid-1920s, the Congress came to be more visibly associated with openly Hindu religious nationalist groups like the Hindu Mahasabha, and as relations between Hindus and Muslims worsened, each community organized religious processions with their militant fervor, provoking Hindu-Muslim communal clashes and riots in various parts of the country. Now, every riot deepened the distance between these two communities. So far, we have understood in the limitations of the civil disobedience movement, we see that not all sections of the society were involved. Now, to put this into a simple perspective, like I said, the civil disobedience movement took into account the industrialists, the workers, the peasants, the people who were, a part of the establishments and all of that. But it ignored a huge amount of population who were rather ignored for a very long period of time, where, for example, the untouchables. So the untouchables, who were led by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, was actually fighting for separate electoral representation in the central and the legislative councils. And that is how we see that there was a major disagreement between Gandhiji and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, which culminated on the second roundtable conference. Eventually, Gandhiji went on to a fast unto death, and Ambedkar had to succeed to this, and there was something called the Pune Pact. Now, in the Pune Pact, there were some reserved seats, but which came to be eventually known as the scheduled castes or the depressed classes. Now, on the other hand, with the Hindu-Muslim picture in idea, we see the Muslim representation in the political organization also was very little or lukewarm in response to the civil disobedience, because after the non-cooperation Khilafat movement, a huge number of people, of Muslims, felt that they were being alienated and separated from the Congress. Because after the 1920s, Congress started to be identified more visibly with openly Hindu religious nationalist groups like the Hindu Mahasabha. So this only deepened the distance between the two communities and eventually led to the idea of a separate two-nation theory. Now, the Congress and the Muslim League. Now, here we see in this very remarkable picture is Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru and Maulana Azad at the Sevagram Ashram, Wardha in the year 1935. Now, the Congress and the Muslim League made efforts to renegotiate an alliance, and in the year 1927, it appeared that such a unity could actually be achieved. Now, the problem was the important differences over the question of representation in the future assemblies that would be or would be elected. Now, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, one of the leaders of the Muslim League, was willing to give up the demand for separate electorates if Muslims were assured reserved seats in the Central Assembly and representation according to their population in the Muslim-dominated provinces of Bengal and Punjab. Now, this negotiation started over the question of representation. All of this continued, but all hope of dissolving the practice or the issue at the All Parties Conference disappeared when M.R. Jaikar of the Hindu Mahasabha strongly opposed efforts at compromise. So what we see is the civil disobedience movement started when there was an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust among the communities. So separated and alienated from the Congress, a large sections of Muslims could not respond for a call for united struggle. And many Muslim leaders and intellectuals expressed the concern about the status of Muslims as a minority within India. They feared that the culture and the identity of minorities would be submerged under the domination of a Hindu majority. Now, here we have a discussion about how the contributions of the Muslim League were actually happening, and let's try to go in detail and read through this. In 1930, Sir Muhammad Iqbal, a president who was the president of the Muslim League, reiterated that the importance of separate electorates for Muslims as an important safeguard for their minority political interests. Now, his statement is supposed to have provided the intellectual justification for the creation of Pakistan, which eventually came up in the subsequent years. So let's see and go through the lines that what exactly did he say. He said, I have no hesitation in declaring that if the principle that the Indian Muslim is entitled to full and free development on the lines of his own culture and tradition in his own Indian homelands is recognized as a basis of a permanent communal settlement, he will be ready to stake his all for the freedom of India. The principle that each group is entitled to free development on its own lines is not inspired by any feeling of narrow communalism. A community which is inspired by feelings of ill will towards other communities is low and ignoble. I entertain the highest respect for the customs, laws, religions and social institutions of other communities. Nay, it is my duty according to the teachings of the Quran even to defend their places of worship if need be. Yet, I love the communal group which is the source of life and behavior and which has formed me what I am by giving me its religion, its literature, its thought, its culture and thereby its whole past as a living operative factor in my present consciousness. Communalism in its higher aspect then is indispensable to the formation of a harmonious whole country in a country like India. The units of Indian society are not territorial as in the case of European countries. The principle of European democracy cannot be applied to India without recognizing the fact of communal groups. So the Muslim demand for the creation of a Muslim India within India is therefore perfectly justified. Now the Hindu thinks that separate electorates are contrary to the spirit of true nationalism because he understands the word nation to mean a kind of universal amalgamation in which no communal entity ought to retain its private individuality. Such a state of things, however, does not exist. India is a land of racial and religious variety. Now add to this the general economic inferiority of Muslims, their enormous debt, especially in Punjab, and their insufficient majorities in some of the provinces as at present constituted, and you will begin to see clearly the meaning of our anxiety to retain separate electorates. So in this particular note by Sir Muhammad Iqbal, who was the president of the Muslim League, he justifies the need for Pakistan because he thinks that the whole idea of India depends upon recognizing the communal groups within the country. So how the idea of how the European nations function cannot be applied to India, and we need to see between the lines. And because there is some apprehension regarding the inferiority which is on the economic front for the Muslims, and similarly when they are able to retain their own individuality, they say that they want separate electorates. So this is the idea of communalism given by Iqbal. And communalism is in a way that where each group has to safeguard its own life, behavior, that its own religion and literature gives through its culture, and therefore becomes an entire operative factor in the present consciousness. So they say that this idea of communalism was the reason for the two-nation theory eventually proposed by Muhammad Ali Jinnah in the years to follow. But nevertheless, at this point, important conjunction of the civil disobedience movement, we see that all the people have got their own point of view, and India being a culmination of all of these things was able to accommodate what exactly the people are looking for. So this is how the political organizations led to the mobilization of the Muslim League and eventually the development and creation of a separate Muslim state, which is known today as Pakistan. So all of these events, eventually are happen to be the limitations of the civil disobedience movement, because a huge populations like the untouchables or the depressed classes or the scheduled classes as we know it today were actually the reason for not participating because they were ignored. And then the efforts of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar and the disagreement with Gandhiji, and eventually the reservation or creation of separate electorates or reserved classes was accommodated. And another major outbreak of this was in the later part of 1930s to 1940s, where you notice that there was the development of a separate Muslim representation. So people, Muslims felt alienated because they are not being part of, post the non-cooperation Khilafat movement, and the Congress started to be identified as visibly with more of the Hindu nationalist groups like the Hindu Mahasabha. And as we mentioned here, Sir Muhammad Iqbal talks about how his idea of communalism is actually brought about. So this is the major limitation of the civil disobedience movement, which we can notice and appreciate in this section. Thank you very much.